Hello students, once again you're welcome to Waidsum University. Without much ado, let's begin. Okay, without much ado, let's begin. Now, today you're welcome again to this course, Information Privacy Engineering and Privacy by Design. Okay, now let's move to our next Okay, today's chapter is chapter 11. This is chapter 11 of this course, and the chapter is risk management and privacy impact assessment. So we're looking at risk management and privacy impact assessment. Where we're according to the General Data Protection Regulation, which is promulgated by the European Union, they have described the privacy impact assessment in the following context. It said, privacy impact assessment, which is PIA, is a situation that requires the processing of the informations, whereby we're using new technologies, application of new technology put in place, and taking into cognizance the nature of the privacy and the scope, the context, the purposes of the processes. And this is also likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individuals that are involved, the principal subject, the data subject upon which these personally identifiable informations are being collected in the first place. Okay, so this is the rights and freedom of these owners of these personally identifiable informations, and the controller shall, prior to the processing of this personally identifiable information, carry out an assessment of the impact of the envisaged processing operations on the protections of the personal data. So the controller should carry out an assessment of what the impact will look like when this is done. Okay, so a single assessment may address a set of similar processing operations that present a similar high risk. Okay, now let's go to still on the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation promulgated by the in 2016 or 17. The European Union formulated this policy document that regulates and protects data. Okay, so this is called the General Data Protection Regulation, and this document has stated that in terms of mandates that the privacy impact assessment should include a systematic description of the envisaged processing operation. So there should be a clear understanding, there should be a clear description of the processes and the operations that are going to be taking place, and the purpose for the processing of this information or this data. There must be purpose for which this data will be processed, this data that will be collected from the data subjects. That's the principal data subjects, the individuals whose personally identifiable information has been collected in the first place, and that the purpose of this processes should be let known, and including where applicable, where is it going to be used, and the legitimate interest pursued by the controller. So all these things should be stipulated in this general data protection, in this privacy impact assessment document that has been as regulated or as formulated by the General Data Protection Regulation. Another thing that this General Data Protection Regulation has mandated in this document that should be included in the privacy impact assessment is the assessment of the assessment of the necessity and proportionality of processing. So they have to assess the reasons why this data should be carried out, this processing of this data should be carried out. So the assessment should look at this, the necessity for the reasons behind why these corporations or organizations are processing this individual's data, and then the proportionality of the processes operation in relation to the purposes. So the relationship here, when we say proportionality, we're looking at the relationship between the necessity and the the operations, the reasons for the operations, or the purposes for which this is being carried out. Then again, the General Data Protection Regulation has also mandated that the personally identifiable information, the privacy impact assessment, should they look at an assessment of the risk to the rights and freedom of the data subject. The data subject is the individual upon which this data is being processed. So there should be an assessment of the risk to the rights and freedom of the individual whose personally identifiable information is being processed. So when we are looking at the privacy impact assessment, we have to strongly look at the rights and the freedoms of these individuals whose data are being processed. Again, the General Data Protection as promulgated by the European Union has also stated that the privacy impact assessment should holistically look at the measure that is envisaged to address the risk. So the risk must be addressed. The measure that is envisaged to address the risk, including the safeguards and the security measures of these individuals' data. The people that you've collected their data, you must be able to envisage and address the risk that will come from the processing of their data. For example, the immigration office, they collect the individual's data, your name, your birthday, all of this, they collect this data. So the impact assessment, the privacy impact assessment should be able to look at areas where or envisage and address issues of risk that hope these individuals' data will not be at risk while they giving you this data to process their passport for them. Hope their information will not be at risk. They hope this organization will not be selling these people's data. Not only immigration office, you look at the healthcare system, because in the hospitals, in the healthcare centers, individuals that personally available information are being collected, and that hope the impact assessment, when you're looking at the privacy impact assessment, hope you're looking at the risk, including the safeguard, how you go to safeguard these people's data that you've collected, their health issues, their social security numbers, their credit card numbers, all of these things, hope they're going to be safe. The security measures that you put in place, the security measure you put in place to ensure that these people, tomorrow you don't come up with story that these people's data have been hacked or hijacked or stolen and be used by other organizations for the sole purpose upon which these data were not collected in the first instance. So these are the guidelines European Union on that General Data Protection Regulation have come up with on where anytime we are carrying out what we call the privacy impact assessment. Not only that, also the mechanism they want to ensure, or they want to see what mechanism you put in place to ensure the protection of the personal data. What mechanism, what methods, what techniques have you put in place to ensure that these individuals' data are highly protected, and to demonstrate the compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation, taking into account or taking into cognizance the rights and legitimate interests of data subjects. The data subjects are the individual upon which this data were collected in the first place. The individuals that you collected this personally identifiable information from in the first place. So you must ensure that the data that you have collected, you must demonstrate a compliance with this European Union General Data Protection Regulation. And meanwhile, you have to take into cognizance the rights and legitimate interests of the data subject and other persons that are in the process that you've collected their data. Then let's take a look at risk assessment. Risk assessment, it has to be carried out in order to ensure that, or give acceptable level of promise that the data that you've collected will, or the organization's data or organization's asset will be protected from threats, from vulnerability, from attackers, and so that the organizations will not be lost at the end of this day. So the first thing to look at is the objective of the risk assessment. What are the objectives of the risk assessment? One of the objectives of the risk assessment is to enable the organization's executive to determine the appropriate budget. So one of the objectives why we carry out risk assessment is to know the budget for security. Is to know the budget for security. We must be able to, the executives of the organization, like the chief, like the one we take a look at in the previous chapter, in chapter 10, when we talked about the chief data protection officer, the chief information security officer, and so on and so forth. All the people, or the chief privacy officer, all the executives that are responsible must be able to ascertain the budget for security. And so, because when you know the budget, you know exactly what you're doing. You'll be able to plan, you'll be able to give a proper plan. Within that budget, you'll be able to implement the security controls to optimize the level of protection that is needed in order to protect the enterprise network, the enterprise system, or also to protect the organization and the individuals whose personal available information has been collected in the first instance. Now, the second objective, or still buttressing on this objective, is that this objective is met by providing an estimate of the potential cost to the organization. What is going to cost the organization to run the security breaches, to run the entire security architecture, and coupled with an estimation of the likelihood of such breaches. So because there are security breaches might occur now or in the future, so the budget should be able to attune or be able to cater for the security breaches either now or in the future. Or the likelihood, when we say the likelihood, the opportunity, the probability that the security breaches might occur should be factored in your budget. So in looking at this, such breaches could be if the scale of such an effort is too ambiguous. So if you look at, sometimes we may overestimate the security breaches, or a project may become too large, right? When we overestimate, when we over budgeted, the cost will be too high on the company or the organization or the enterprise. So the project may become too high, too complicated, and unreviewable project. So the organization may not want to, because every organization wants to make profit. So the organization may not want to review such projects in the nearest future, maybe in a year's time when these contracts expire. So there may be an incentive to leave some things out that you feel that are not too of security breaches to the organization. Things that are considered low risk, very low risk, or very low threat to the organizations may be left out in the budget. On the other hand, if the effective way of calculating the risk are not employed, the manager tends to underestimate the magnitude of the risk and may choose to invest their money or the money of the organization in other areas rather than putting the money in the security area to prevent damages, breaches, and security breaches, and hence avoid the very high impact security high vulnerability on the organization. So what this entails is that we should not overestimate and we should not underestimate, okay? Because underestimation might cost the organization a whole lot, okay? So again, another aspect of the risk assessment is that the responsible executive needs to develop a plan. For security assessment. If an organization have what we call responsible executive, then they need to come up with a risk assessment plan, okay? And this risk assessment plan should be able to cater for what is or look at what is not too much or too little. Should be a balanced plan. Now let's take a look at figure 11.1, which is determining the information security risk. Now when we take a look at information security risk, first we look at the asset, because this is what the organization wants to protect. What you are trying to protect is your asset, information or data that the organization, some information asset, they worth billions of dollars. Some information, they especially organizations that are dealing with information, some of these informations are worth billions of dollars, billions and millions of dollars. So this is what the organization wants to protect. So what you want to protect is your asset. The asset is only a physical entity. An asset could be information that you dearly want to protect. So the threat that comes, when you have an asset, there will definitely going to be security threat. Okay, information security threat. Now the threats are what could happen to cause harm to that your information. Then you have vulnerability. Vulnerability is how could a threat action occur to jeopardize your asset. How is the vulnerability. The loopholes are the vulnerability. The loophole in this security architecture whether being a technical loophole, managerial loophole, procedural loophole, whatever kinds of loophole, human resource loophole, any loophole in an organization or in an enterprise creates what we call, or becomes what we call, the vulnerability. So the how the threat can occur in any of the departments in the enterprise or in the network or in the organization, it's the vulnerability. Then we have the controls. The controls is what is currently reducing the risk. The things, the mechanisms that you've put in place that are currently reducing the risk in an organization, making your system effective. These are your controls. Now, this control, first of all, from the asset, the first one, the asset is the value. Is the value, what you have to guide, the value. Okay, this asset and the threat, both of them, the threat leads to severity. Now, both of them are what leads to the impact. You have to look at what impact, because you have an asset, there's a threat, then we have to look at the impact. What impact this threat has on the asset. So we have what we call the impact analysis, impact as it were. Impact is how this will affect the business, okay? Impact is how much all this hollow balloon will affect the business. Let's choose another color here, because here is green. We take yellow. I think yellow will be conspicuous, more conspicuous. Okay, so the impact, both the assets, since you have an asset, okay, then there's a threat, both of them create an opportunity for impact analysis, impact assessment, in order to determine what is be lost, the lost magnitude. So when you do an impact analysis, you have what we call, you come up with the loss analysis magnitude. How much of this asset will be lost due to threat that has been introduced, or that have had access to this information. So this is the level of risk. Now, before then, you look at the vulnerability. Vulnerability is the extent to which this will happen, right? The strength or frequency is coming from the threat. Both of them, and the control is the effectiveness, give rise to the effectiveness. Both of them create what we call the likelihood. Likelihood is like the probability, how likely these threat actions given the control. So with the control we have, still how fast, how likely is the threat still going to happen. So you already have a control measure put in place in your security network, and still how likely will this very threat still going to happen. So this creates loss invert frequency, and all of this amount to what we call the level of risk. This is how far you have been able to assess the risk that is threatening your organization or your enterprise network. Now let's move on quickly. Risk. This leads us to the risk assessment challenges. What challenges you have? There are 4 elements contributing to determining the risk. One is your asset. Of course, what you have that you want to protect is your asset. What you have that you want to protect is your asset. Okay, what you value so much, what gives you value, what you have. Could be a piece of land in your case, in your physical environment. It could be your car. It could be, because some cars are assets because they work money for you, no matter how you look at it. Okay, your buildings, maybe it gives you value. It works something for you. Whatever you have to protect. But in this regard, we're talking about your information. Your information is your asset in this regard. So an organization needs to put a value on the individual asset, and you must determine what is the value of this your asset, okay, before you know how much you're going to spend on it, on the security, in protecting it, okay. Because if an organization don't put a value on the asset, then they don't know, maybe they overspend in the budgetary, they overspend something that worth $1 million, you spend $2 million to protect it. It doesn't worth it, right? It doesn't worth it. So you must be able to ascertain, put a value on the individual asset that you have, and how that value may be reduced by the specific threat. So this threat that's coming to it, how is it going to reduce the value? If it doesn't reduce the value, even if the threat comes to it, doesn't reduce the value, then there's no point spending such amount of budget on such an asset. Then the threat, you must, in the threat element of risk assessment, we must be able to determine the threat facing an organization. We must be able to ascertain what type of threat this is. There is a past experience to go on and numerous publicly available reports that list correct threats and their corresponding frequency of attack. So they already reported that if you look at the ISO 27005, and there are so many reports that has been reported on the various threats that can happen and what you should do in order to avert this kind of threat. Then number 3 element of the risk assessment challenges is the vulnerability. An organization may have security vulnerability that is not aware of. You may have security vulnerability you are not even aware of. The vulnerability could be coming from your IT infrastructure, could be coming from your human resource, could be coming from your procedural mechanism, could be coming from your technical and operational vulnerability, technical vulnerability, may be coming from even the management. There may be a loophole in the management system which creates a vulnerability on the entire system. So after vulnerability, the 4th element that risk assessment looks at is the controls. The controls are implemented to reduce vulnerability and therefore to reduce the likelihood, the probability that that particular threat will be realized. The probability that that threat will be realized. So controls are things that you put in place in order to reduce your risk, in order to reduce attack, in order to reduce threat, and also cover up for your vulnerability as it were. So these are the 4 risk assessment challenges that we face. Now, risk assessment challenges, here we want to look at another challenge in the risk assessment is the difficulty of predictive future condition, the difficulty of predictive future conditions. Considering the 4 elements, the following problems emerge. Okay, now let's take a look at the first one, which is called the asset. Now, what future problem might emerge or might occur from having asset? Now, whether the planning period is 1 year or 3 years or 5 years, changes in the value of an organization's asset complicate the effort to estimate the impact of the security threat. Because your asset might grow, right? Might get bigger, even if it's an information, you might, as an organization or an enterprise, you might keep acquiring more of that information. So as the asset value changes, whether you've done an assessment for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is, or 1 year as it may, as the value of the asset changes or get complicated, then there will be difficulty in how to estimate the impact of the security threat. Because as the asset get bigger, then the impact of security threat might become more complicated to ascertain. So that's for that. Then the threat itself. The threat, it is difficult to assess the current threat capability of an organization and the intentions of potential adversary. The intention, the potential, those who are going to attack your system, the intention they have is difficult to ascertain them now, let alone the future. In the future projections are even more subject to uncertainty. So it's even more difficult to predict what will happen in the future or how this adversary might attack your entire system. So entire new types of attack may emerge in the future that you don't know of as of today. So these are the future fears and challenges that we have with regards to threat. Then with regards to vulnerability, in the future, changes within the organizations or its assets, IT asset, might create unexpected vulnerability. So as you keep changing your IT system, bringing more infrastructure, more routers, more computers in your system, increasing your bandwidth and all of these things, then as you keep doing this, there might be a loophole, a chance that more vulnerability might be created as you grow, okay, in the future. Then the controls. As in your controls, you're always introducing new technologies, new software techniques, or your networking protocols might change, okay. It might change to provide more opportunity for strengthening your organizations or your defenses. So it is difficult as you're doing this, as you're introducing more software, more technology, more networking protocols, as you're introducing more opportunity for strengthening your organization's defenses. This might be difficult, make it difficult to predict the nature of this new opportunity, much less their cost. Also, resource allocations on planning or over planning period might not be optimal. So all of this that you bring in might have its cost implication, and also might be very well suited or might not be very optimal in achieving your security goals. Here is figure 11.2, which is the cost analysis for risk assessment. So you can see the higher you spend, the more you see your security breaches might be covered, and the lower you spend, the cost of security breaches, the lower the more the security breaches that you might have in your system. Here you see the cost of security controls. So the higher you spend, the more you have control that will help to prevent threat that is happening in your system. But it is advisable to be optimal, to have an optimal cost, to be at the middle, so that you not spend too much, and at the same time you're able to achieve your security objectives. Okay, here are the benefits and drawbacks for quantitative and qualitative analysis that has been carried out. So you can have a look at them. The risks are prioritized by financial impact, asset, and prioritized by financial values. So these are quantitative, financial impact, and the values. All these ones are qualitative. Qualitatives are just the things that you can relate with. That you say, like, enable the visibility and understanding of the risk, ranking, and all of these things. But remember, quantitative is deals with data, with values, discrete values. Okay, so you can take a look at this as it were. Now let's take a look at the qualitative risk assessment. In qualitative, we're going to look at these three categories. But before we talk about the three categories, the FIPS 199 document, the Standard for Security Characterization of Federal Information System, they define three security categories. Now but these three categories are, we say these categories first of all addresses the potential impact on the organization, and also ensures that there is no jeopardies on the IT assets on the organization needed by the organization to accomplish its assigned mission, protect its asset, and all of these things. Now let's take a look at the categories. These three categories are low, medium, or moderate, and then we have the high. What do we mean by low, medium, moderate, or high? Now the first one, which is the low means what is expected to have a limited adverse effect on organization's operations, organizational asset, or individual. This might cause a degradation in the mission capability to the extent and the duration that the organization is able to perform its primary function. Then the low result in minor damage to the organization's asset. The low also results in minor financial loss. The low results in minor harm to the individuals. So low is just the characterization that has to do with the risk is low, the threat is low. So what the impact on your system is not so high. The result from the impact is minor. The harm is minor. The harm to the individual is minor. The result on the financial loss is minor, and everything is minor when we talk about low. So when we say moderate or medium, it's expected to have a serious adverse effect on the organization's operation. So medium risk is something that is expected to have serious adverse effect on the organization's operations, organization's asset, and or the individual. And this might cause a significant degradation in the mission capability, and then this result in sufficient damage to the organization's asset, and this might also result in significant financial loss, and this might result in significant harm to the individual that does not involve loss of life or serious life-threatening injuries. So you see, this is a bit say result to significant damage, result to significant financial loss. So whatever is lost in the medium the risk, security risk here in the medium podium is significant enough. Is significant enough to cause damages to the organization or to the individual. Then the high is expected to have a very severe, catastrophic adverse effect on the organization's operation and the organization's asset, or the individual as it were, because we might be speaking about organization or an individual. So the high has very, very severe or catastrophic adverse effect on the organization, quote unquote, organizational operations, the organization's asset, and the individual as it were. Now, this can cause a severe degradation, very severe degradation. You see, here we're using severe, result in major damage to organization's asset. This will result to severe or catastrophic harm to the individual that is involving the loss of life. This could result to loss of life or serious life-threatening injuries. Okay, now let's move on. Now, if you take a look at this is a qualitative risk determination. And here we're looking at the different parameters. Threat, the threat, this is a vulnerability as a function of threat resistance. So you can see vulnerability plotted against a threat. So when you plot vulnerability against threat, you have the high, then you have medium, high here, high on this way, you have the medium. And then you have medium. Then you have medium, low. So this is the result what you get. Okay, when you have the resistance plotted against vulnerability. Then when you have likelihood of event plotted against vulnerability or threat, this is what you have. Likelihood as a function of threat and vulnerability. So this is what you have. Then when you have threat or the impact itself as a function of asset and exposure, this is what you have. Then when you have a risk as a function of impact and likelihood, this is what you have. So you see high, medium, high, this is what you have. Impact plotted against risk, this is what the result what you have. Okay, let's move on quickly. So still looking at the architecture description and organizational input. The first thing you do when you are doing risk management framework, because this canonical block diagram is a risk NIST risk management framework. Now this is our figure 11.4. When you do what we call the NIST risk management framework, the first thing you have to do in your step 1 is to categorize information system. That's the first thing you do. You have to categorize them, the different categories of the information system. Okay, this step 2, what you need to do is select security controls that you have to use. Remember, this canonical block diagram is coming from FIPS 200. This is these are systems that are adopted from already formulated guidelines. Okay, already formulated guidelines. Step 2 is to select your security controls. Your step 3 is to implement security controls. Okay, your step 3 is to implement. Your step 2 is called your security plan, which is to select the security control. This is your security plan. Your step 4 is your assessment report, which is what you have to do is to assess your security control. You have to assess your step 4, which is called the assessment report. After you implement your security control in your step 3, you have to assess it in your step 4 to see whether it's working properly. Your step 5 is to authorize information system. This is called the plan of action. It's to authorize. You have to authorize your information system. Then your step 6 is to monitor. Your step 6 is to monitor security state. Okay? And then you repeat the system continuously to ensure that your enterprise network is properly secured. Okay? So now let's move on quickly. Still on this figure 11.5 is talking about the ISO 27500 risk management process. So in risk management process, the first thing you have to do is the context establishment. Okay? And then you carry out your risk assessment. In your risk assessment, what you need to do is your risk identification, which area you identify your risk. In which area is it from is there vulnerability, human resource vulnerability, technical vulnerability, procedural vulnerability. So where do you see risk? So you have to identify the risk, the potential risk that can happen to the enterprise. Then you do what we call the risk analysis. You carry out your analysis of the risk. What type of risk is this? High, low, or moderate, or medium? So which of them you have to carry out your analysis, and how to mitigate your budgetary, what can you cater for, what kind of control are available. Then you carry out your risk evaluation. Now you evaluate these various risks and see whether it's worth it to invest a lot of money of the organization. Now, if risk decision points, if it's okay, everything is okay, then you move on to the next one, which is called the risk treatment. If no, you go back to the contest establishment again and carry out your risk identification, risk analysis, and it's like a flow chart, and then risk evaluation. If no. If yes, you move to risk treatment. If no, you go back again to carry out all these three processes. If yes, then we move to risk treatment. Then you treat the risk. And we're going to describe the risk treatment, the various way of treating risk, okay? And then if yes, you move on to risk acceptance. If no, you go back to treating the risk again. You have to carry out the treatment again. Okay, so this is called the risk. On the left, on the right, we call this the risk monitoring review. And then on the left is risk communication and consultation. So all of this is called the risk management process. Is that okay? Now let's move on. So this is table 11.2, risk management contest establishment. This takes a look at the various categories, the purpose of your risk management. Your purpose, you have to look at the legal compliance, you have to look at the preparation of business continuity plan, the preparation of an incident response plan. All of this then you have to talk about the risk evaluation criteria, what kind of criteria you use, the strategic values of the business information process, the criteriality, the criticality of information assets, okay, that is involved. All of this you have to look at. Then you have to look at the impact criteria, the level of classification of the impacted information asset, the breaches that is involved, the breach of information security. You have to look at this, the impact, how this will affect the organization, the impaired operations, what this will happen to the organization when this risk has happened to the organization, the loss of business and financial value, and all of this you have to. Then the risk acceptance. So this is all you have for this table 11 risk management contest establishment. Now let's go to the risk evaluation. Let's talk about the risk evaluation. Now, the risk evaluation involves comparing the results of risk analysis and risk evaluation criteria. So we have to compare, when you are doing risk evaluation, you have to compare the risk analysis, the result of your risk analysis, okay, and the risk evaluation criteria. So we say, after a risk analysis is done on your organization or of your enterprise, senior security management and the executive will determine whether to accept a particular risk and if not, determine the priority in assigning resources to mitigate the risk. So they have to have a meeting, they have to meet to ascertain what to do, what type of risk, is it worth it, is it serious, how is it going to derail the organization's objectives, security objectives. So they have to ascertain. If not, they have to determine the priority. Is it worth it, what they have to put the resources, the organization's resources on, or it has to wait, or it can wait. So they have to ascertain this. Now the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, the 27005, makes a distinction between risk evaluation criteria and risk acceptance criteria. So this document, this ISO is a document, okay? This ISO 27005 is a document that creates a distinction or distinguishes between risk evaluation criteria and risk acceptance criteria. These documents are available for anyone or a graduate of this information to use in implementing your organization if you get this position in any organization. Now, the first one is evaluating the criteria. The evaluation criteria focus on what? So, we said there is a distinction between the risk evaluation criteria and risk acceptance criteria. Now, the risk evaluation criteria focus on the importance of the various business assets, and the impact that the risk will cause the organization. Okay, the impact of the risk, the impact of the threat on the organization, Okay, this is what it will cost to the security of the security of the organization. So this is what the risk evaluation criteria focus on. Focus on the importance of your asset and what the impact this threat could cause the organization. Why the risk acceptance, the risk acceptor criteria relates to how much risk the organization can tolerate. So the risk acceptance criteria is focusing on how much risk this organization can tolerate and provide guidelines on how this budget should be allocated for risk treatment. Okay, so the risk acceptance criteria is focusing on how much risk the organization can tolerate and what budget should be used for risk treatment, if it's worth it at all. Okay, now let's move still on risk evaluation. If you look at SP 800-100, provides some of the guidelines or some guidelines for evaluating risk. Okay, now these guidelines are one, they are called the three-level model. The first among the three-level model is called the high. The second among the three-level model is called the moderate. The third among the three-level model is called the low. Now, on the high looks at if an observation or finding is evaluated as high risk. So if you have carried out your assessment and you found out that this is a high risk, then there's a strong need for corrective measures, right? Then an existing system may continue to operate, but a corrective action plan must be put in place in order to curb the threat that may happen to the organization. So this is considered as high. Therefore, the moderate, if an observation is rated as moderate risk, if after carrying out your risk assessment, the observation report is saying that this is rating it as a moderate risk, the corrective actions are needed also. They are needed because moderate risks are still considered not to be good for the organization. So corrective actions are also needed, and a plan must be developed in order to incorporate these actions within the reasonable period of time. Meaning, you may not be too in a haste, but there must be a reasonable time frame to develop a plan to curb these risks, as it were. Then, if the outcome of risk assessment or the observation from the risk assessment is described as a low risk, the systems authorizing officials, that's the IT guys, the whatever it is, the CPO, whatever authority is authorizing the security, then these people must determine whether the corrective actions are still required or decide to accept the risk. Because there are times you have to accept the risk because it's not worth the millions that you go to spend, the organization is going to spend, if the risks are considered to be low risk and they're not going to jeopardize the organization's security objectives. So, but it's left for these security officials or executives to determine whether to create an action plan to curb the security or to let it go because it may not have so much impact on the system. Now let's take a look at risk treatment. Risk treatment, the figure 11.6 takes a holistic look at risk treatment. Every risk has the four element or the following ways of treating it. One is to first of all reduce the risk. Okay, one way of treating risk in an organization is to reduce the risk impact. The second way is to risk retention. The third one is risk avoidance. So one way of treating risk is to avoid it totally. Put measure in place and mechanism in place to ensure that the risk does not even come to the organization. The fourth method is to transfer the risk. Okay, when risk comes, you transfer them. All of this amount to what we call the residual risk. All this treatment can only be implemented for only residual risk. Okay, so this is the block diagram for treating residual risk. Now let's move on. Privacy risk assessment. Now we bring the privacy into risk assessment. Now NIST SP 800-53 has a document that is published called the Security and Privacy Control for Information System and Organization. And this document defines the Privacy Impact Assessment, PIA, Privacy Impact Assessment. defines the privacy impact assessment, or also refers to it as a data protection impact assessment, DPIA, data protection impact assessment, as the analysis of how information is handled to ensure they handily conform to the applicable legal, regulatory, and policies requirement regarding the privacy of the organization or of the individual. Also, this privacy impact assessment, the analysis that is carried out ensures that to determine the risk and effect of creating, collecting, using, processing, storing, maintaining, disseminating, disclosing, and disposing of information in the identifiable form in an electronic information system. Then it also ensures, the analysis also ensure how to handle by examining, evaluating, protecting, and alternate processes for handling information to mitigate potential privacy concerns. So now let's still on privacy risk assessment. We have about 9 different types of privacy risk assessment, or 9 different areas or elements of privacy risk assessment. I think we use the word element for about 9 different elements of privacy risk assessment. The first one is the privacy threat. A threat is a potential for violations of privacy. Any potential, it has not happened yet, any potential for violation of your privacy that exists when there is a circumstance or a capability, an actions or an event that could violate your privacy or that can cause harm to the organization or the individual is called the privacy threat. The privacy vulnerability is a flaw, a loophole, a weakness, a loophole in a system's design, implementations, or operation, or even the management that could be exploited intentionally or unintentionally to violate the system's privacy policy and compromise the personally identifiable information. So that's the vulnerability. Then the third element of privacy risk assessment is the privacy breach. Privacy breach is a situation in which the personally identifiable information is processed in violation of one or more relevant privacy safeguarding elements. So when you carry out what you are not authorized to do in processing the personally identifiable information, this is a privacy breach. Then the fourth element of privacy risk assessment is the privacy harm. The privacy harm is an adverse experience for an individual resulting from the processing of his or her personally identifiable information. So that's a harm. Something has already happened. The adverse experience there, the big deal that has happened to you, coming from your personally identifiable information, be tampered with. Then the fifth element of privacy risk assessment is the privacy impact. The impact is the magnitude, how big, the size of the cost or harm from a problematic data action. The size, the magnitude of the cost or harm, how this has cost you, okay, is called the privacy impact. Now let's take a look at the privacy control, which is the sixth element of the privacy risk assessment. The privacy control looks at the administrative, the technical, the physical safeguards employed within the organization or by the organization or by the individual to satisfy privacy requirements. The seventh element is the privacy risk. The seventh element of privacy risk assessment is the privacy risk itself. A privacy risk is a combination of likelihood that individual will experience problems resulting from data processing and the impact should they occur. So a privacy risk is just the combination of the probability that the individual will experience problems, okay, from the data that they have in the system. Then this eighth element is the privacy risk assessment itself. So the eighth element of privacy risk assessment is the privacy risk assessment itself. These are all like a subset of the main set, okay? The main set is the privacy risk assessment. All the elements that I've mentioned, they are like subsets of the main set itself. So the the privacy risk assessment is a subset of its own self, right? So it's also an element of this context. So the privacy risk assessment is a process for identifying and evaluating and prioritizing specific risk arising from data processing. The process for identifying, for evaluating, for prioritizing the specific risk arising from the system or processing of your data. So that's what we call the privacy risk assessment. The last but not the least is the privacy risk management, which is also an element of the privacy risk assessment. The privacy risk management is a cross-organizational set of processes for identifying, assessing, and responding to privacy risks when they occur in an organization. Now let's take a look at figure 11.7, which is the privacy risk management framework. The privacy risk management framework. Now here, when you look at privacy risk management, it attains everything, both the assessment, the whatever, all the parameters you've looked at, the elements of the privacy risk assessment, the PII, the employees, everyone in it, collaborated to what we call the privacy risk management. In privacy risk management, you have what we call the privacy impact assessment. Like I said earlier, the privacy impact assessment all are part of the privacy risk management. Okay, the privacy impact assessment is a subset of privacy risk management. Even the privacy risk assessment is a subset of the privacy risk management. Now, in this, the first thing we have is privacy risk assessment. In order to carry out the privacy risk assessment, we have to prepare the context and priorities. When we prepare context and the priorities of what we want to assess, then we have to assess the privacy risk. That's the next thing. After assessing the privacy risk, we have to select the security and privacy controls that should be used or put in place in order to prevent the potential threat, harm, vulnerability, as it were. Now, the privacy risk, these are called the privacy risk treatment, because you've selected the security and privacy controls. So they are called the privacy treatment. After that, we move to implement the security and privacy controls. Now, when you implement, this is called the privacy control implementation. Then in your implementation, it entails not only to implement, you also have to assess the control implementations. Not only you assess the control implementation, you have to authorize the information system, and you have to monitor the privacy state. All of this leads to back to your first step. So all these 4 steps that you carry out, like implement the security and the privacy controls, assess the control implementation, authorize information system, and monitor the privacy state. All of these are called the privacy control implementations. So is one state, despite it comprises of 4 elements. So we have the select security privacy, which is the treatment. This is called the privacy risk treatment. Okay, so from here, the privacy risk assessment is this one. When you prepare the context and priority and you assess the privacy risk, this one is called the privacy risk assessment. So you have the privacy impact assessment comprises of privacy risk assessment and privacy risk treatment. That's for the impact assessment. Both the privacy risk assessment and privacy treatment, they are called the privacy impact assessment. Then when you include the privacy risk assessment and privacy risk treatment, which form the privacy impact assessment, and then when you add the privacy control implementation, it becomes the privacy risk management. So when you put these 3 phases together, privacy risk assessment, privacy risk treatment, and privacy control implementation, when you put all of them together, it becomes the privacy risk management. Is that okay? Now let's move on quickly. The next one is figure 11.8, determining the privacy risk. When, like we said earlier, when you try to determine the privacy risk, how much risk is present, you will first of all look at the PI, personal identifiable information. What are you trying to protect? Your asset, the personal identifiable information that you try to protect. Then the threat, what could happen to cause the harm to this, what you are trying to protect. And both of these two, they are called the privacy impacts. Okay, when you analyze them, when you look at prejudicial potential, level of identification, the threat frequency. When you look at all of this, it will lead to privacy impact. Your privacy impact, okay, when you look at this two, it will lead to what we call the privacy impact. Now, your privacy impact, okay, is what is the privacy harm that could happen to the data subject. That's your privacy impact and your business, your entire business. Then after that, you look at the vulnerability area, the how, the loopholes, the flaws, okay, area that this thing can happen. How could a threat occur? So these are your vulnerability, the extent, okay. And then when you look at your control, we looked at something like this before. The control is what is currently reducing your risk for you, the effectiveness, what is making it effective. So these two promulgate what we call the likelihood, the probability that you will skate through or you solve the problem. So the privacy impact leads to what we call the loss. When you look at the privacy impact, when you carry out impact assessment, you'll be able to ascertain the magnitude of the loss, okay, that will happen to your information that you try to protect. Then the loss of event frequency, all of them will result to what we call the level of privacy risk. Okay, so this figure examine the level of privacy risk. Okay, 11.8. Now let's move on quickly. Threat to privacy classification. There are about 7, right? About 7 threats to privacy classification. 7 different threats that could happen to your organization or to the individual or to the enterprise. The first one is called appropriation. Appropriation is the use of personally identifiable information in ways that could exceed the individual's expectation, or the way you have given authority for them to use your information. When they exceed the level upon which you have allowed them to use your personally identifiable information, this is called appropriation. Appropriation also occurs when personal information is used in ways that the individual would object to, the way you would like. When your information are used in a way that you would not like, or would have expected additional value for, or you would have asked if they are exceeding your initial agreement, they are using your information beyond your initial agreement, you expected that they pay you for this. When this don't happen, they don't pay you, but they go ahead to use your information beyond your agreement. This is called appropriation. It's a threat to privacy. It's one of the classifications to the threat to privacy. Appropriation is one of the threats. Number 2 is distortion. Distortion is the use or dissemination of inaccurate or misleading, incomplete personal information. This one, the politicians, they do this a lot. Okay, during election cycles, politicians, they carry out what we call distortion. It's a threat to privacy. It's a threat to privacy. They carry out distortion. They use or they disseminate inaccurate information, misleading, incomplete personal information about one another just to win election. And this is not good. Your election campaign should be issue based. Okay, so back to security, information security. When people use or disseminate inaccurate information about an individual after they have a first-hand information on the individual, and whether it's been done by an organization or by a third-party adversary, this is categorized or classified as distortion. Then the third threat to privacy is induced disclosure. Induced disclosure could include, in movie when you hear order duress. I was order duress, meaning you were forced to say some of the things that you said. Okay, even if they are correct, you were forced. Okay, in the law, in the legal case, you can claim that you were order duress. Whatever you said, you were order duress. You were not saying it from your own volition. You were forced to say that. Force was applied. So induced disclosure is a threat to privacy. One of the aspects of induced disclosure is pressure to divulge personal information. You're being pressurized to give this information out. Then another one is induced disclosure itself. Induced disclosure includes can occur when user feel compelled. You're compelled to provide information disappropriate to the purpose or outcome of the transaction. You are forced, you are compelled to say that, okay, information that you feel that they are disappropriate to the reason why they be collected. Then another way of induced disclosure, you can see induced disclosure. Another way you see it from a perspective you can see induced disclosure from is can include leveraging access or privilege to essential or perceived essential service. Okay, now let's go to the fourth one. The fourth one is insecurity. Insecurity is let's choose another color. I think this yellow is not very conspicuous. Let's choose green. Okay. Insecurity. So, threat to privacy classification. One of it is insecurity. Insecurity, the improper protection and handling of personal identifiable information. Improper. You're not protecting it well, and then they get into the hands of the wrong people. Then identity theft also is one potential consequence, like when you steal intellectual property or you steal someone's identity, and these are all insecurity in information classification. Another possible consequence is the dissemination of false information about a person through alteration of that person's record. So you go to people's record, you have software now to modify people's record, and then you go and modify their records and give false information about them. These are all these false or insecurity in as regards to threat to privacy. Then number 5 is surveillance. Now, surveillance is seen as tracking or monitoring of personal information. Tracking or monitoring of personal information that is disappropriate to the purpose or the outcome of the service. Surveillance is not only limited to this, it includes the difference between the data actions of monitoring and the problematic data actions of surveillance can be very narrow. Then you say user behavior, transactions, and personal information may be tracked for operational purposes, but it becomes surveillance when it leads to privacy harms. When it leads to privacy harm, this becomes surveillance. Like, for example, FBI, they always watching people, some people that they've seen or perceived to be having one or two issues. Okay, it could be behavioral issues, could be transactional issues, could be personal issues, and they may be tracking these people for the purposes that may best be seen as security, national security for United States. So hence they place surveillance on this type of people by either using satellite or using whatever means that best suits this. Okay, surveillance is a threat to privacy. Okay, it's one of the threats to privacy. That's the point we're trying to make. Okay, the sixth threat to privacy is unanticipated revelation. Unanticipated revelation is non-contextual use of data that reveals or exposes an individual or facet of individual in an unexpected way. And also unanticipated revelation can arise from aggregations and analysis of large and diverse data sets. Okay, so all these are unanticipated revelation. Then unwarranted restriction, blocking tangible access to personal valuable information and limiting awareness of the existence of this information within the system is one of the unwarranted restrictions. So this is several scope. These several things that we've described: appropriation, distortion, induced disclosure, insecurity, surveillance, unanticipated revelation, or warranted restriction. All these several points are threat to privacy. Okay, now let's go to privacy harm. Privacy harm, an organization can determine potential privacy harm by developing a profile of personally identifiable information that is stored and or flows through the organization's information system and cross-referencing that to potential threat. Now let's take a look at this threat. The impact can be classified as following. One is loss of self-determination when privacy harm happens to individual. So when individuals are harmed, when their privacy has been jeopardized, has been compromised, the following impact happens to them. One is loss of self-determination. This individual may lose their sovereignty and ability to feel freely or make free choices because they've been attacked, they've been harmed. Their information have been compromised. Their informations have been compromised. Then under the loss of self-determination, we have this subsection like loss of autonomy. They may lose their autonomy, which may result to changes in their behavior, including self-imposed restrictions of freedom of expression and assembly. Then exclusion, the people will lack knowledge about or access to personal and verifiable information. They will exclude themselves, they will go into isolation, and so on and so forth. Number 3, other loss of self-determination is loss of liberty. These people will become improper exposure to arrest or detainment. Incomplete or inaccurate information can lead to arrest. So they will no longer have liberty and they will not be free, they lack freedom. The physical harm also can happen to them. Actual physical harm can happen to the person, because when loss of self-determination happens, the people can even commit suicide. Some people can commit suicide. Number 2 to privacy harm is the discrimination, the unfair or unequal treatment of individual. This includes the following. 1 is stigmatization. Okay, discrimination includes this stigmatization. You label these people as what? You give them name, you stigmatize them, you embarrass them, you cause emotional distress to them, emotional damage to them, and all of this as a result of discrimination. And stigmatization is an example of discrimination. The power imbalance. Discrimination can result to power imbalance. Then number 4 is loss of trust. The breach of implicit and explicit expectation or agreement about handling of personal information, it can result from privacy harm. Privacy harm can result to loss of trust. Number 5 is economic loss. Number 5 is economic loss. Economic loss, when privacy harm can result to economic loss, in the sense that direct financial losses can happen when you be hacked, when you be harmed online, when your information has been stolen, when your very personally sensitive information has been stolen, and when your information asset has been stolen. So this can result to economic loss. Still on privacy harms, with respect to the organizational losses, NISTIR 8062 is a document which is an introduction to privacy engineering and risk management in federal system, suggests that the organization may be able to use other costs as proxies to help account for individual impact, including the legal compliance costs arising from the problem created for the individual. Also, they can use the mission failure costs. Also can use reputational costs leading to lost trust. Also can use internal culture costs. Okay, all of this, the individual can have vest or harness this cost to exonerate itself, to find a way out of this problem. The assessment of privacy impact. This assessment of privacy impact has 2 holistic views. The first one is the prejudicial potential. The prejudicial potential is an estimation of how much damage would be caused by all the potential consequences of a threat. That's number 1, prejudicial potential. Number 2 is the level of identification, an estimation of how easy it is to identify data subjects with the available data processed by the available software. So these are the 2 concepts or categories of privacy, of assessment of privacy impact. Okay, if you look at here, we have the different level: low, very low, low, medium, high, very high assessment. Okay, you look at the impact on the privacy, on the personal identifiable principles. You also look at the impact on the organization. Okay, still on that, then you have, if you have this, you have table 11.5, privacy impact normalization scale. You look at the level of identification and prejudicial effect. Less than 4, you call it very low. 4 to 5, you call it low. 6, you call it moderate. 7, you call it high. Greater than 7, you call it very high. So these are the scale of normalization for the questionnaire preparation that we use for ascertaining the privacy impact assessment. Now let's go to the probabilities, the likelihood. The likelihood also has been documented in ISO, the NIST IRO 802, it defines the likelihood in the privacy risk assessment as the estimated probability that a threat action will occur and can be problematic for a representative or a typical individual whose personal identifiable information is processed by the system. Now, this take a holistic look at. This is a complex issue that involves assessing the following 4 factors. Now, these factors are the probability that a threat action will be attempted, either intentionally or unintentionally. Then the second one is the capability of the threat agent to perform the threat. This person that is going to carry out the threat, what is the capability? What sophistication does he have? How sure are you that this person can be able to carry out the threat? That's the second level of the. The third level is the vulnerability in the system that would enable the attempted threat action to occur. How vulnerable? Look at all the facets and all departments in the organization. What phase do you think the vulnerable? How vulnerable is the organization to this attempted threat that be threatened by these people? Then the fourth one is the reduction in the probability due to the effectiveness of existing or planned security and privacy controls. The system you have that creates controls that has reduced the probability or the likelihood of attack on the entire system. So these are the 4 factors that are used for assessing the likelihood of the attack occurring in the system. Now, with the impact assessment, the risk analyst can use a 5-level scale for each of the factors. So you have to use the 5 level, like the very high, low, the very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. These are the 5-level scale. So you use this 5-level scale for each of these factors that we've itemized. Is that okay? So that's what we have done here. You look at it. Okay. Now let's take a look at the potential privacy vulnerability. The potential privacy vulnerability can happen in the technical. So you have about, how many of them? You have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You have about 7 areas or aspects of vulnerability within the organization. One is the technical vulnerability, the flaws in the designs, implementation, all the flaws, all the loopholes in the design and implementation. They are called the technical vulnerability. You have the human resource vulnerability. The human resource vulnerability are the flaws that are in the persons, the persons that carry out training, employment, and all of this recruitment, the gaps in the awareness and trainings, gaps in the disciplines and improper terminations of assets and so on and so forth. So all those gaps can create what we call the vulnerability, human resource vulnerability. Number 3 is the physical and environmental vulnerability. Okay, the insufficient physical access control or poor safety of equipment, inadequate temperature, humidity controls, all of this inadequately conditioned electrical powers, all of this can result to what we call the physical and environmental vulnerability. Then operational vulnerability, lack of change management, control, and all of these things. Hardening, control over software installation, control over system communication, inadequate separation of duties. All of this result to operational vulnerability. Then business continuity and compliance vulnerability, misplaced, missing, or inadequate processes for appropriate management of business risk, adequate business continuity, contingency planning. All of this result to what we call business continuity and compliance vulnerability. Policies and procedural vulnerability, privacy policies and procedures that are inadequate to fully protect the personally identifiable information creates a vulnerability. Then the last but not the least, data set vulnerability, weakness in your de-identification techniques or anonymization. Okay, all this one creates a vulnerability in the system. So these several processes create potential privacy vulnerability in the system. Now let's go to assessing privacy risk. In assessing privacy risk, you're going to look at the very high, the moderate, the low, the very low. Okay, we talked about this. Is that okay? All these are be itemized in the various system. So when you carry out this, you see in figure 11.9, you see two examples of privacy risk matrices. Here are matrices, the impact and risk assessment. For this you have the very high risk itemized in this place. You have the medium, the moderate, the low, and the very low here. For this impact analysis, the likelihood of event, okay, you see the very high is spread horizontally and vertically in this matrix, and then the high is also spread horizontally and vertically here. The medium is also horizontally and vertically here, and then the low is horizontal and vertical, and then the very low is just at this corner. So these are two cognitive likelihood of event that has been carried out looking at the risk plotted against the impact that has been carried out for the events. Okay, now here is the ISO 29134 PI privacy impact assessment process. Now here you look at, these are the things you have to do in your privacy impact assessment. You have to perform PTA. PTA is the privacy threshold analysis. So you have to first of all perform what we call the privacy threshold analysis. You have to prepare for the privacy impact assessment, and then you have to perform the privacy impact assessment. You have to publish the privacy impact assessment. You have to implement the risk treatment and review, audit, and implement. And when this, you always come here to perform. Okay, so from here you see you have what we call the identify personally information flow. You have to identify your personally identifiable information flow, and then you have to also identify potential user behavior. You have to determine the privacy safeguarding requirements. You have to assess the privacy risk, and then you have to determine the risk treatment. So all these ones are performed here. All these five processes, like identify your personally identifiable information, identify potential user behavior, determine privacy safeguarding requirements, risk assessment, assess privacy risk, and determine the risk treatment. All these ones are carried out in the perform privacy assessment. So when we say perform privacy assessment, you have to carry out these five functions. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. So let's move on. Then we go to the privacy threshold analysis. The privacy threshold, the benchmark, the benchmark for privacy that you can tolerate is what we regard to as privacy threshold analysis. Okay, now a brief assessment that requires systems owner to answer basic questions on the nature of their system, whether the system contains personally identifiable information, to identify systems that require privacy impact assessment. So we have to look at your PII in order to be able to ascertain which systems require privacy impact assessment. Then also, this approach enables agencies to ensure that the system undergo the privacy impact assessment process at the earliest stages of development. A typical privacy threshold analysis include the following information, these three information. So the privacy threshold analysis include this following information. One is the description of the system. Two is what PII, if any, is collected, what personally identifiable information is collected from the organization or by the organization from the individual, and therefore whom this personally identifiable information is collected from, which individual did you collect them from. So these are your threshold analysis. We have to know the description of your system, and then we have to know what PII you have collected, and who did you collect this PII from. So these are the threshold parameters, okay, the privacy threshold analysis parameters that we consider. Now let's move on to the preparing for a privacy impact assessment. When you're preparing for privacy impact assessment, the important components of privacy impact preparation are: you have to identify the privacy impact assessment team and provide it with a direction. So you have to know the team and give them a direction, what you want them to do. Then prepare a PII, privacy impact assessment. Then you describe the system or project that is the subject of your privacy impact assessment. Then you have to identify the stakeholder. So these 4 blocks describe the preparation for privacy impact assessment. Okay, they describe the process for privacy impact assessment. Here is the workflow diagram for personally identifiable information. How you collect them, how you use them, how you transfer them is shown in this block diagram. Now here, determine relevant privacy safeguarding requirements. Here we look at how we determine the relevant privacy safeguarding requirement. One, we look at the legal and regulatory. The legal and regulatory determine the laws and the regulations that applies to the case. We have the contractual, which determines what privacy safeguards are required by the applicable contract. Then we have the business. The business determines what privacy safeguards are a normal part of a business operations as it applies. Then we have the individual. The individual determines which FIPS are relevant to this case. Okay, now let's move on to assess privacy risk. In assessing privacy risk, we have to look at the risk identification, we have to look at the risk analysis, we have to look at the risk evaluation. Now, the risk identification, the assessor identifies the potential threat and the system vulnerability that are applicable to this case. Then the risk analysis, the assessor calculates the level of risk for each potential impact that may happen to the organization. Then the risk evaluation, the assessors determine the relative prioritizations of privacy risk based on the severity of privacy impact on personally identifiable information principle as well as the overall impact on the organization. Okay, now let's move on quickly. Determine risk treatment. In order to determine risk treatment, we have to look at the final step of the final step of the privacy impact assessment is to determine what risk treatment will be applied to the identified risk. This involves three tasks. First, you have to choose the treatment option. Second, you have to determine the control, and third, you have to create the risk treatment plans. These are the three processes that you have to do in order to determine the risk in order to be able to treat the risk that comes to the organization. You have to choose the treatment option, you have to determine the control, and then you have to create risk treatment plans. Okay, now the PI reports. After that, you have to give a report. After you've treated that, you have to give a report. Now, the objective of the PI report includes the following. There are four major objectives of PI report. Why we report, so the other can learn from this, right? So the objective of the privacy impact assessment report includes one, to demonstrate that the privacy impact assessment process was performed in accordance with the organization's policies. That's the first one. We carry out the report in order to show that it conforms with the organization's policies, right? Number two is to provide the basis for post-implementation review. So you now have a basis for post-implementation review. That's one of the reasons for the report. Another reason for the report is to provide input to an information privacy audit. So whenever we have information privacy audit, the person already has inputs, already has some data that has been carried out on the privacy impact assessment to work with in order to carry out the audit. Then the fourth is that provide a document basis if iterations of the privacy impact assessment process for these projects are necessary, if you have to do it again. So when you already have a document, the report is already the document. So every time you have to do this again, you already have a document that you have to refer to. Okay, so these are four objectives for carrying out what we call the privacy impact assessment report. Now let's move on quickly. The privacy impact assessment report is based on a review of numerous examples of privacy impact reports from Australia, from Canada, from New Zealand, from United Kingdom, from United States. Okay, so all these are based on the review from the various examples that has been carried out from these various countries that we've enumerated. Okay, and then they said that the privacy impact assessment project recommends that the privacy impact assessment report should clarify whether the PIA was initiated, that's privacy impact assessment, was initiated early enough so that there was still time to influence the outcome, whether you initiate it early enough. Number one. Number two is to indicate who conducted the PIA, the privacy impact assessment. Number three is to include a description of the project to be assessed. You have to tell us the description of the project that you are assessing, the purpose for which you are assessing this project, and any relevant contextual information. Then number 4 is the map of the information flow. You have to, so in your report you have to show the flow, the map of the flow of information. Number 5 is to check the project's compliance against the relevant legislation, whether the project is compliant to the laws and legislation of the country upon which it's operating, or the guidelines of the ISO. Then number 5 is to identify the risk to or impact on the privacy, the impact on the privacy. Number 6 is identify the solutions or options for avoiding or mitigating the risk. Number 6 is make recommendation on what should be done. And number 7 is to be published. You have to publish your report. Is that okay? So that others can learn from this. Okay, so that's for the PA report. PA report, review and audit. PA report implement the risk treatment, right? Privacy, the privacy impact assessment report. 1, it implements the risk treatment, and 2, it reviews or audit implementation. It's used for audit implementation. Okay, then that's it. The end of this is that we have looked at the overall risk assessment process, the summary of this chapter. We've looked at the risk assessment process. We've looked at the comparison of quantitative and qualitative risk assessment. We've looked at overview of the NIST and ISO risk management frameworks. We've looked at the major options for risk treatment. We've looked at the purpose of the privacy threshold analysis. We've looked at the major steps in the privacy impact analysis. We've also looked at the purpose of a privacy impact analysis report. So we thank you very much, and this is the end of this section.